Good evening. Welcome to Thursday night Bible study. I'm Pastor David Stewart from Forest Chapel Church. Tonight we're continuing our studies based on the book Through the Bible in 1 Year by Dr. Alan Stringfellow. The featured book of the Bible tonight is the book of Numbers. Now, Numbers gets its name originally starting with a Greek word arithmai, which translated in Latin is numeri, and hence we get the word numbers in English. It was named this because there are two times in the book of Numbers where the children of Israel are numbered or a census is taken, once at the beginning and then towards the end of the book. In the old Hebrew Pentateuch, in the old Hebrew book of the law, its actual name was in the wilderness. And Numbers 1 and verse 1. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai. There's your wilderness. On the first day of the second month of the second year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. And then God goes on to say to Moses to take a census of the people. Both of these names, Numbers and in the wilderness, tell the story of this book. Now, Numbers begins where Exodus left off. There is just 1 month in between the two books. And in between are the Levitical instructions, the instructions that we have in the book of Leviticus. Exodus chapter 40, verse 17. So the tabernacle was set up on the first day of the month in the second year. First day of the month in the second year. The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the second year. There in Numbers. So there was 1 month in between. There is a census that is taken, and the people then are organized for the march to Canaan. They're headed to the promised land. God is leading the way. The people will get in sight of the land of Canaan, and then the nation disbelieves and rebels. The judgment of God results in 40 years of wandering so that the old generation dies off. A new generation then is numbered to go into the land of Canaan. That is the book of Numbers in a nutshell. The importance of this book. Well, Numbers is referred to in the New Testament over and over again. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. So Paul is here writing about their forefathers, those that were on this march, those that passed through the sea when God parted it. Going on, they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. And here we go. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in 1 day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. So what did you notice here? Paul refers to warnings and examples, pagan partying, sexual immorality, testing the Lord. And verse 12 has the warning for us. These were all events that Paul refers to, events that take place in Numbers. Hebrews chapter 3, and I'm not going to read all 12 verses, but verses 7 through 19. And I'll pick up just a couple. In these verses, there are reminders for us not to harden our hearts like the Israelites did. There are warnings about unbelief. Hebrews chapter 3, I'll pick up verse 12. See to it, brothers, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. And verse 14. We have come to share in Christ if we hold firmly till the end the confidence we had at first. And verse 19. So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. Speaking about the Hebrews. Now, the structure of the book of Numbers is a pretty simple structure. It is a book of movement of the people. And the book deals with two different generations. There's the old generation, and it's covered in chapters 1 through 14. Then from chapters 15 through 20, there is a wandering, which is called the transition era, when the old generation is dying off and the new generation is being populated. From chapters 21 through 36, it is the story of the new generation. And it also includes preparations as this new generation is getting ready to go into Canaan, or the promised land. Things to remember. There are two generations. There are two numberings. There are two journeys. And there are two sets of instructions, one to the old generation and one to the new. The two instructions for the old generation, chapters 5 through 9, have the instructions of God. And for the new generation, chapters 28 through 36, carry the instructions. The central message of the book of Numbers is found in Numbers chapter 9, verses 15 through 20. Numbers chapter 9, 15 through 20. On the day the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, was set up, the cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. That is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp, and then at his command, they would set out. It's all about guidance and direction in this book. Guidance and direction. Let's turn to the Gospel of John and examine the words of Jesus dealing with guidance. Chapter 14 and verse 6. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. I am the way, truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me, Jesus said. Guidance. John chapter 8, verse 12. Jesus again says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus is our cloud by day and fire by night. He is our guidance. And looking to deliverance, Numbers chapter 10, verse 29. Now Moses said to Hobab, son of Ruel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are setting out for the place about which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will treat you well, for the Lord has promised good things to Israel. Deliverance. In Numbers chapter 21, verses 6 through 9. Now dealing with the new generation. 21 and verses 6 through 9. Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, we sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us. So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Then anyone who was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, he lived. Deliverance. So let's get a little bit more detailed into the breakdown of the book of Numbers. The first section that we'll deal with is chapters 1 through 14. And these deal with the old generation and their journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh. Now, God had told Moses, back when Moses had fled from Egypt and he had settled in Midian, God told Moses, when God spoke to him from the burning bush, that he was to set the people free. He was to bring this great nation out of Egypt. And once he did, he was to bring them to Mount Sinai, where God would explain to him, would talk to him, would give him what the next steps were. And so they did. They journeyed to Mount Sinai, where God spoke to Moses. Moses was there 40 days and 40 nights. Out much of the book of Leviticus came out of those 40 days and 40 nights Moses had there on the mountain. The month that we have in between the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers. So the people then go from Sinai to Kadesh. In chapters 1 through 4, we have the census. Chapter 1 is when they number all of the adult males. Chapter 2 is the distribution of the tribes. Chapter 3 is the numbering of the Levite males. The Levites were the priests. Chapter 4 is a distribution of the duties of the Levites, how they were to serve. Now, the basic reason for the numbering or the census is for military purposes. So they would know how many men they had that were available to fight, what ages they were. By knowing such data as that, you know whether you are prepared to take on a certain enemy or not. Each of the 12 tribes was numbered, and each was assigned a position around the tabernacle. Now, let's take a look at a diagram here. Each of the tribes is placed around the tabernacle. Now, we learned about the tabernacle being built, looked at a picture of what the tabernacle very likely looked like. Here we have the tabernacle. Moses and Aaron and the priests, who were Aaron's sons, they would stay on the east side towards the sunrise of the tabernacle. That's where they would stay. Then the 12 tribes of Israel were broken down into segments of threes: 3 to the east, 3 to the south, 3 to the west, and 3 to the north. Dan, Asher, Naphtali to the north, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun to the east, to the south, Gad, Simeon, and Reuben. And then, of course, to the west, Benjamin, Manasseh, and Ephraim. This was referred to as the camp of Ephraim. To the south, that was referred to as the camp of Reuben. To the east, the camp of Judah. To the west, the camp of Dan. Each of those were the 4 eldest brothers, and that is the reason that these camps were named. And then, of course, the tabernacle was in the middle. Now, these various groups here, Merarites, Gershonites, Kohathites, these all had various responsibilities within the tabernacle. Some as simple as they were involved with carrying, when the people were on the move, with carrying the parts of the tabernacle. Some had to do with things having to do with worship, with singing, or with musicians. But that is what that looked like when the tribe would encamp. So when we see here that they were numbered and assigned a position around the tabernacle, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Now, chapter 3 is devoted to a census of the tribe of Levi. They were still went through a census, but they were exempt from the general census. The Levites were not going to be involved as soldiers. They would not be involved in fighting. Their role was to be the priests, set apart to serve God and to see that the tabernacle was cared for. Chapters 5 through 10, God gives instructions dealing with the inward condition of the camp. Chapter 5 deals with purity, deals with honesty, deals with truth. Chapter 6 covers the vows of the Nazarites. These were those men who vowed to live totally separated lives to God. Some of the regulations in their vows: they could not have any wine, no fermented drink. They could not drink grape juice or grapes, or eat raisins. And no razor was to come on their head. Chapter 7 gives instructions for the free will offering for leaders of the tribes. In chapter 8, we find the consecration of the Levites. Levites were to be between the ages of 25 and 50. They were to undergo a cleansing service of water. They were to have their heads shaved, and they were to offer an offering of grain. The Levites were also to be the firstborn. Chapter 9 shows the people the keeping of the Passover, and it tells us about the pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night. This was the guidance of God. Now, remember that the Passover was a memorial of past deliverance. For us, the Lord's Supper is a memorial for deliverance through Jesus. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 26. Familiar words for us from our communion services, the Lord's Supper. Chapter 11, verse 26. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. To remember. Chapter 10, verses 1 through 10, God commands Moses to make 2 trumpets for calling the assembly. The pillar of cloud was guidance for the eye, but the trumpets gave guidance for the ear. 1 Thessalonians refers to a time when the last trumpet is going to sound. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. Brothers, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's own word, we tell you that we who are still alive, we who are left till the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. And the dead in Christ will rise. The last trumpet. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage each other with these words. There will be a last trumpet. Now, beginning at verse 11 of chapter 10 and carrying through chapter 14, it deals with the journey of the old generation. Chapters 11 through 14, we find the people moving towards the promised land. It's almost within their grasp. Then after 3 days, they begin to complain. Even Aaron and Miriam become jealous of their brother Moses. And at a place called Kadesh Barnea, they show their sinfulness and their unbelief. Then 12 spies are sent out. They are to search the land, search the promised land, and they come back with a negative report. Part of it is positive. They come back and say, yes, the land is flowing with milk and honey. The grapevines were so large and so huge, we could barely carry them. They speak of the fig trees and all the produce of Canaan. But they say the people are huge. We were as grasshoppers in their sight, they say. And the people are scared. Of those 12 spies, only 2, Joshua and Caleb, said, we can do it. Let's go up and possess the land. But the crowd would not believe them. And judgment falls in the form of 40 years of wandering. Let's look at verses 29 through 33 of chapter 14. Numbers 14, verses 29 through 33. In this desert, God says, your bodies will fall. Every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But you, your bodies will fall in this desert. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness, until the last of your bodies lies in the desert. 40 years of wandering. Let's look at a map. Gives us an idea of these wanderings. So here's Egypt, and the people leave Egypt with Moses. There's the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel lived. They continue south here, down beside the Red Sea, cut across the wilderness of Egypt, down here to the area of Migdol, and this is where the army of Egypt, the Pharaoh, finally caught up to the people. You have the crossing of the Red Sea. They are on this is on their way to Mount Sinai. They get to Mount Sinai where they will camp while Moses is on the mountain. Then they leave and they head north, as you can follow this red area up here to Kadesh Barnea. And you can see they are this is the land of Canaan right here. They are right here on the edge. These 12 spies go here. And now they will begin this process of wandering for 40 years. They leave Kadesh Barnea and they will travel through the edge of this wilderness. And this will be their wilderness wandering for 40 years. Chapters 15 through 20, they cover this wilderness wandering. And this is a transition time from the old generation to the new generation, with the old generation all dying off except for the two faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb. God told the people in verse 29 of chapter 14 that their children would go into the land instead of them. For all those years that they wandered, and they ended up coming back to the same spot where they had been, Kadesh Barnea. Now, all through this time, God communicated with them through Moses. Chapter 15, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them. Chapter 15, verse 17. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them. In verse 35 of chapter 15. Again, the Lord said to Moses. So God was continually speaking to Moses, giving him the wisdom for what will come next. God gives them food, gives them water, gives them clothes, even gives them shoes. Turning to the next book, which is Deuteronomy chapter 8, looking at verses 2 through 6. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and to test you in whether or not he would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna which neither you nor your fathers had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and revering him. In chapter 16, there is an attack on the priesthood, and over 15,000 people die in earthquake, fire, and plague. Then God causes the rod of Aaron, the rod that he laid down before Pharaoh that changed to a snake, the rod that Moses held as they were scared and wondering what was going to happen at the edge of the Red Sea. That rod, God causes this old stick, really, to blossom. And that shows that God put his approval on the priesthood and the leadership of Aaron. That rod is also a symbol that we have of Jesus, because Jesus is our high priest. Hebrews chapter 4. And if you haven't been with us before, as we've been studying these Old Testament books, very important to read Hebrews as you go along through these Old Testament books, especially these first five, which were considered the law, because the letter of Hebrews was written to Jews by a Christian who understood the Jewish religion and explains the differences between the Hebrew faith, the system of sacrifices and priests, and our high priest, who is Jesus. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And then let's flip over to Hebrews chapter 5 and look at verses 4 through 10. No one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was. So Christ did not take upon himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." Quoting from the Psalms. And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be the high priest. Chapter 20 has the record of the death of Miriam. It also has a record of the sin of Moses, when Moses struck a rock twice. God had told him just to speak to the rock and that water would flow. But Moses, as you might imagine, didn't believe God. No, I just talk to the rock and it's going to bring forth water. And Moses showed disbelief when he struck that rock. And so Moses was not allowed to go in to the promised land. Numbers chapter 20, verse 12. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." In verse 24 of Numbers chapter 20, Aaron dies. Now, beginning with chapter 21, it is the record of the new generation. They have wandered the 40 years. The old generation has died off, except for Moses and Joshua and Caleb. Chapters 21 through 36, this is a new journeying. And this is the new journey of the new generation from Kadesh Barnea to Moab. Now, let's go back and take a look at our map. At this new journeying. So the people had been at Kadesh Barnea the first time, then they came back and wandered They're 40 years. And now here's Moab. And now the people, the new generation, is now moving to Kadesh Barnea, is now moving towards the land of Canaan. Okay, the land of Canaan is the land on the west side of the Jordan River. They're coming up the east side of the Dead Sea, referred to in those times as the Salt Sea. They're coming up on this west side. They're going to come through Jericho and this direction to go into the new land. And chapters 21 through 36 is the record of this particular journey. No more delay. They're ready to go. Now, their journey was made a little bit longer because the kingdom of Edom would not allow them to pass through their territory. And so they had to take a little bit wider route when they were traveling. Let's look at Numbers chapter 20 and verses 14 through 22. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, saying, "This is what your brother Israel says. You know about all the hardships that have come upon us. Our forefathers that went down into Egypt, and we lived there many years. The Egyptians mistreated us and our fathers, but when we cried out to the Lord, he heard our cry and sent an angel, brought us out of Egypt. Now we are here at Kadesh, a town at the edge of your territory. Please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territory." But Edom answered, "You may not pass through here. If you try, we will march out and attack you with the sword." The Israelites replied, "We will go along the main road, and if we or our livestock drink any of your water, we will pay for it. We only want to pass through on foot, nothing else." Again they answered, "You may not pass through." Then Edom came out against them with a large and powerful army. Since Edom refused to let them go through their territory, Israel turned away from them. The whole Israelite community set out from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. At Mount Hor, near the border of Edom, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Aaron will be gathered to his people." Let's move to 21, verse 4. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom, but the people grew impatient on the way. "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the desert? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food." And they're speaking of the manna that God provided for them. Notice again, here we have despair, here we have complaining, here we have murmuring, and this time God sends in serpents. But God provides a way to be saved. Numbers 21, verses 8 and 9. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, he lived. Now let's compare that to the Gospel of John. John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. Just as Moses lifted up the snake, and this is Jesus speaking here. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. So that snake was lifted up to save. In the same way, Jesus was lifted up on the cross in order to save us. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 9 and 10. 1 Corinthians 10, 9 and 10. We should not test the Lord, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. Do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. We aren't to test God. We aren't to grumble. We aren't to complain. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 15. Peter's talking about the prophets for hire. The people of Israel deal with one of them as they're headed to the promised land as well. They have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness. But he was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, a beast without speech, who spoke with a man's voice and restrained the prophet's madness. Jude 11 also speaks about false prophets being blind to a higher morality, being blind to the message of the cross. Chapters 26 through 27, there's a new numbering of this new generation, a new census that is taken. At the beginning of the 40 years wandering, there were about 600,000 men. And at the end of the 40 years, there are also about 600,000 men. In Numbers chapter 26, verse 64, Numbers chapter 27, verses 12 through 14, Moses is told of his impending death. And then Joshua is the one that's appointed to take his place. Numbers 27, verses 12 through 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, go up this mountain in the Abarim range and see the land I've given the Israelites. God is letting Moses go up on top of the mountain. They are up here, across the Jordan River from Jericho, and there's some large hills up here where you can actually see over into the land of Canaan. This is where God sends Moses. See the land I have given the Israelites. After you have seen it, you too will be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was. So you're going to die as well, Moses. For when the community rebelled at the waters in the desert of Zin, both of you disobeyed my command to honor me as holy before their eyes. These were the waters of Meribah, Kadesh, in the desert of Zin. Chapters 28 through 36 in Numbers then deal with new instructions of God for this new generation. Chapters 28 and 29 specifically deal with offerings that are to be given to God. Chapter 30 refers to the vows of men and women that want to commit their lives to living for God. In chapter 31, the new nation goes to war. Their purpose is to avenge the children of Israel against the Midianites. And in this battle, not a single Hebrew life is lost. Numbers 31, verse 49. Let's see. Then the officers, I'm going to start at verse 48 if you're following along. Then the officers who were over the units of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, went to Moses and said to him, "Your servants have counted the soldiers under our command. Not one is missing." In chapters 32 through 36, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh request to settle on the east side of the Jordan River. Now let's go back to our map again. Their request is to be on the east side. Okay, here is the east side of the Jordan River. This is the land of Canaan. This is the land that God promised them. And this is where God wanted the people to settle. These tribes, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, request to settle on the other side. Their place should have been inside of Canaan and not on the outside. And what happens later as a result of this choice that they make, and the fact that Joshua gave in to them and allowed them to settle over there? First Chronicles chapter 5, verses 18 through 26. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh had 44,760 men ready for military service, able-bodied men who could handle shield and sword, who could use a bow, and who were trained for battle. They waged war against the Hagrites, Jeter, Naphish, and Nodab. They were helped in fighting them, and God handed the Hagrites and all their allies over to them because they cried out to him during the battle. He answered their prayers because they trusted in him. They seized the livestock of the Hagrites, 50,000 camels, 250,000 sheep, and 2,000 donkeys. They also took 100,000 people captive, and many others fell slain because the battle was God's. And they occupied the land until the exile. The people of the half tribe of Manasseh were numerous. They settled in the land from Bashan to Baal Hermon. Bashan to Baal Hermon. That is Senir, or Mount Hermon. These were the heads of their families: Epher, Ishi, Eliel, Azrael, Jeremiah, Hadaviah, and Jadiel. They were brave warriors, famous men, and heads of their families. Now listen to this, verses 25 and 26. But they were unfaithful to the God of their fathers and prostituted themselves to the gods of the peoples of the land. They let their culture draw them in to the gods of the peoples of the land whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, who took the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh into exile. He took them to Halah, Habor, Hara, and the river of Gozan, where they are to this day. Those were the first of the tribes of Israel to be taken captive and to be taken away. Numbers chapter 32 records that they were choosing from what they could see. That land looked really good for them, instead of accepting the instructions of God to go across the Jordan and to settle the west area, the land of Canaan. Other instructions, chapter 35 deals with the cities of refuge. Verses 6 through 8 speak of the number of the cities, what the purpose is of the cities of refuge. Let's look at that in chapter 35, verses 9 through 12. You will hear of the cities of refuge as we continue to journey through the Old Testament. Deuteronomy, you will hear more of them. But in Numbers chapter 35, you see what the purpose is of a city of refuge. 35 verses 9 through 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, When you cross the Jordan into Canaan, select some towns to be your cities of refuge, to which a person who has killed someone accidentally may flee. They will be places of refuge from the avenger, so that a person accused of murder may not die before he stands trial before the assembly. That was the purpose of these cities of refuge. Also in chapter 35, it describes how these cities of refuge are distributed around the 12 tribes and the regulations for those cities. Then the book closes with the security of their inheritance. And the book closes dealing with the security of this inheritance that they have from God. It's a reminder of the security that we have in Jesus. Book of Numbers. So, who is the main character in the book of Numbers? A lot of things you could say, but the main character that we see acting throughout the book of Numbers is God. God, the Lord, said to Moses. Moses is just carrying the message of God. Yes, we see Moses speaking to the people, but each time it's because God said to Moses, say to the people. God is the main character. Who holds the office of high priest? Well, that would be Aaron. How many generations are found in the book? And that's 2. Why did they wander in the wilderness for 40 years? Disobedience and unfaithfulness. What's the central truth of the book of Numbers? Two things: guidance and deliverance. The guidance of God, the deliverance of God. And the last question, can you name the 3 main sections in the book of Numbers? Old generation, wandering, transition, both the same section, and new generation. Those are the 3 basic segments to the book of Numbers. Old generation, the wandering, which is also a time of transition as the old generation dies off. And then the 3rd segment is the new generation. So next week, we're looking at Deuteronomy. If you're going to try to read through the whole book, 6 chapters each day will get you prepared for Deuteronomy. Thank you for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of the week, and hope you will join us again as we look at Deuteronomy. For those of us who are local, we'll be meeting at 7 o'clock on Sunday evening for our live Bible study. And as always, if you do not have a church home, if you're in the area, I invite you to come out and join us for worship. Forest Chapel is located just off of 340, right across from Sammy Station at the intersection of 612 and 340. Blessings. Have a great evening.